This is Here, the Happiest People on Earth, Chapter 9, titled Foot on the Table. The answer was not long in coming. Shortly after the new year, we had a phone call from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. It was Tommy Hicks phoning from the rear of an auditorium where he'd just spoken. "Deimos," he said, "I think you've got chapter number 2. That evening, he'd told the story of the fellowship and the vision. At the end of his talk, a man in the audience stood up and asked why they couldn't have a group like that in Sioux Falls. I told him, sure you could. I asked anyone who was interested to come down front, and Deimos, it looked like the whole room came forward. You've got yourselves group number 2 here in South Dakota." It was only the beginning. Wherever Tommy went that year, he talked about the fellowship. He left a trail of enthusiastic men behind him, and by the summer of 1953 we had 9 chapters and were planning a national convention in October, exactly 2 years from the first meeting in Clifton's cafeteria. 600 people showed up for that fall weekend at the Clark Hotel in Los Angeles. Today, when a convention can draw 20,000, that first national meeting seems small indeed, but to us it was enormous, and so was the eagerness. For instance, there was the question of a budget. We had a full-time employee now, Floyd Highfield, who answered inquiries from men around the country, put them in touch with each other, and helped them get organized into chapters. One of these days, Floyd was going to need a secretary. Then there was the magazine. Tom Nickel was donating his time and equipment, but someone had to pay for the paper and the ink. Already we could see we'd have to print more than the 5,000 copies a month we'd started with. We estimated that in 1954 we would need around $10,000. So on the last night of the convention, one of the speakers, Jack Coe, stood up and made the simplest appeal for money I've ever heard. Jack was a huge man with a knack for coming straight to the point. "We need $10,000, he said. "I would like 100 men to come forward and pledge $100 each." Then he sat down. At once, men began converging on the speaker's table. Jack asked each one to write his name and address on a sheet of paper. At the end of the meeting, we tallied up the names. Exactly 100 men had made pledges. The budget had been raised to the penny. And meanwhile, the Saturday meetings at Clifton's were becoming a different kind of problem. The first year, we couldn't talk men into coming. Now we couldn't keep them away. The upper room seating capacity was 400. We were squeezing in 500 or 600 each week. Sometimes as many as 700 showed up, standing around the walls, jamming the staircase. For 6 weeks in a row, the fire department sent officials who threatened to close down the entire restaurant. And so we held a meeting of the board of directors, still a little awed at finding ourselves with something to direct, to discuss the situation. We could find a bigger meeting place, the Clark Ballroom, for example, or we can encourage the men who'd been coming to Clifton's to start new chapters near their own houses. Long Beach, Glendale, Pasadena. Why shouldn't each of them have its own Clifton's, a center of power from which the life of the Spirit could reach into the community? I do not want a big centralized organization. That was the message the Spirit seemed to give us. Of course, come together on occasion to inspire and encourage each other, to light a fire bright enough for many to see. But for your day in, year out work, I want you small, local, sensitive to me. I do not want uniformity. I will never come to 2 men or 2 places in just the same way. Give me outlets for my infinite variety. And so the Saturday morning meeting at Clifton's became 4 groups, then 5, then 10. Some met weekly, some bi-weekly, some once a month. Some continued to meet Saturday mornings, others chose a weekday evening. As these in turn got too large, more than 300 or 400 men at a meeting, they too formed offshoot groups until today there are 42 chapters in the Los Angeles area, each with a flavor all its own. Some are demonstrative, some reserved, some stress teaching, others healing, evangelism, youth work. But none would have existed without the first year of seemingly hopeless struggle, and so it was wherever this fellowship spread. The first year in any area seemed to be the toughest. Minneapolis, for example. In 1955, a restaurant owner invited 13 of us from the fellowship to come there for the kickoff banquet of the first Minnesota chapter. We traveled through a snowstorm from all around the county. I flew from C.C. Ford, a builder from Denver. I flew with C.C. Ford, a builder from Denver, in his four-seater Cessna. I was grateful no one from our church could see us as the little single-engine plane bounced crazily through the sky. Waiting for us at the Minneapolis airport was Clayton Sunmore. He made light of the storm. We're used to snow here in Minneapolis. We'll have 250 key business people out this evening. At his restaurant, we discovered that was so confident of why he was so confident of a big turnout. Fried chicken, homemade pie, fresh apple pie, homemade bread, fresh apple pie. Waiters were already setting out the mouth-watering food on a long buffet table. All 13 of us from the fellowship had made it. I was relieved to see, in spite of the weather, and we stood around comparing notes on our journeys while Sunmore greeted the local men who were starting to arrive. 7 o'clock arrived, the hour for the banquet to begin. 28 people had gathered in the dining room, 13 of us, 15 counting Clayton Sunmore from Minneapolis. 7:30, 28 hungry people eyed the laden buffet table. The weather's keeping people home, someone suggested, but through the windows we could hear a steady stream of traffic moving past on well-plowed streets. At 8 o'clock, 28 of us sat down to eat. Fewer people than there were tables in the big room. Sunmore's face was a study. I knew exactly how he felt, but I also knew something else. There is a pattern here, God's pattern. I told the discouraged restaurant man about our experience in Los Angeles, how we couldn't give breakfast away any more than he could give away dinner. But God doesn't need vast numbers to launch his work. He needs only a few in each place. Don't look at the 236 empty places, I told him. Look at the 14 men who came. With these 14, God can turn this city upside down. It turned out to be a wonderful meeting. The main speaker was Henry Krause, a manufacturer from Hutchinson, Kansas, and chairman of the fellowship's board of directors. Henry stood up and faced the nearly empty room as eagerly as though it had been packed. He didn't preach a sermon. Like all our men, he simply told his own story, how one day as he was plowing his wheat field and praying, as he often did alone on his tractor, God showed him a new kind of plow. Henry Krause wasn't an especially mechanically minded person, but there was this machine before his eyes, complete in every detail. When he got back to the house, he drew a picture of it, and the more he looked at it, the more he realized that with a plow like that, if it worked, he could plow 3 times as much ground with the same tractor in the same length of time. Henry made more exact drawings and began taking them around to manufacturers. Everywhere the reaction of the technical experts was the same. The thing wouldn't work. Henry was no expert and no technician, but he believed his design had come from God, and he knew that God was expert and master craftsman both. And so out in his barn, Henry began building the plow himself, hammering it out blade by blade from scrap metal and second-hand parts. It took many months, working over a handmade forge, before the plow was completed just as he had seen it. He hooked it to the tractor and drove it into the field. And it did work. The Krause plow was now used all over the world, and Henry Krause was one of the country's largest manufacturers of farm equipment, a businessman who devoted half his time and all of his heart to God's service. An electric energy had built in the room. When Henry spoke, you could literally feel the Spirit fall on a meeting. 3 of the men from Minneapolis received the baptism sitting at their table, without anyone laying hands on them or saying a single prayer. We were all gathered around them, rejoicing, when a waiter burst through the door from the kitchen. "Mr. Sunmore, can you come right away?" Down in the basement, it seemed, one of the maintenance men had some kind of seizure. The waiter didn't know whether it was a heart attack or an epileptic fit. Several of us hurried down the stairs. Outside the furnace room, a group of men were holding another fellow in a chair. And suddenly I began to laugh. This man wasn't sick. He was quite simply what the old-timers in the Armenian church called under conviction. "Brother," I said, "praise God. Thank him that he sought you and found you tonight." The man opened his eyes. He looked scared to death. And no wonder. It must have been something to feel the power of God sweep without warning through that cement corridor. The man hadn't even known that there was a prayer meeting going on up in the restaurant. Well, he came back upstairs with us, and you've never seen a more thoroughly converted individual. First, he had a lot of things in his life he wanted to confess. Then he couldn't tell God how much he loved him. The episode was like God's verdict on a meeting that by human measurements had failed. It was as though he told us, "Don't worry about numbers. I'll find the people I want, wherever they are, and I'll bring them to you. Do your part faithfully and leave the rest to me." And that's what they did. there in Minneapolis. That original little group of men, including one boiler room mechanic, kept meeting steadily and regularly, seeing no growth for 6 months, no visible impact of what they were doing, and then all at once men started coming, 200, 500, 1,000, and it was Los Angeles all over again. So alive was the Minneapolis area, in fact, that a year and a half after that snowy night we held our annual nationwide convention there. And it was at that convention in the fall of '56 that we saw the first real breakdown of barriers between Pentecostals and a mainline denominational church. For years, of course, individuals of all denominations have been coming into the fullness of the Spirit, and in general they had faced two choices: to stay in their church and keep quiet about this new dimension, or to leave and join some Pentecostal group. But Pentecost welcomed and nurtured in the historic churches themselves. We saw them the first day of the convention, sitting in the back row of the ballroom at the Leamington Hotel, as though prepared to bolt at any instant, 5 Lutheran ministers. Whatever they heard, it was evidently not too alarming, because they were back the next night and sitting a little farther front. The third day, a Wednesday breakfast meeting, they were there again, eager to receive. They told us, whatever Christ has for us. A group of us from the fellowship went to their table and prayed that Jesus would fill them with his Spirit. Afterward, they thanked us courteously and left. It was all very quiet, very sedate, and very Lutheran. We didn't know until later if our prayer had been answered. It had been. One clergyman had received the baptism while driving home in his car, another while shaving the next morning. A third remembered one of the convention speakers saying that it is not when we strain and strive that we receive God's gifts, but when we are most relaxed. Where do I relax the best? The minister asked himself. A moment later, he was standing under a warm shower, praising God in a heavenly language. It was the beginning of a transformation which has since swept Lutheran congregations from coast to coast. Not a rejection of their traditional strengths, but the very opposite, an empowering of Lutherans, clergy and laymen alike, to make the statements of their faith a day-by-day reality. Since then, we've watched the same power sweep many denominations: Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, Roman Catholics, Episcopalians, always at first a handful of half-hostile people coming to a meeting and out of curiosity. Then the wind of the Spirit blowing through whole churches, whole communions. It was only 7 students from Notre Dame who spoke in tongues that Monday night in March 1967 in the home of Ray Bullard, president of our South Bend Fellowship chapter. But the joy and power they found in that basement room were such that today Ray is regarded by many as a kind of spiritual godfather to the worldwide Catholic Pentecostal movement springing from Notre Dame. The key again was the small local chapter meeting regularly, sometimes in discouragement, praying for South Bend, waiting, as St. Gregory waited, for God's perfect time. No man, of course, can see the timetable whole, only fragments here and there. In October 1974, a fragment was supplied for me when I was invited to the Vatican to receive an official appreciation for the role of the fellowship in reaching millions of Roman Catholic laymen. Millions, I thought dazedly as I walked out past the colorful row of Swiss guardsmen. Millions. Don't worry about numbers. That had been God's word to us from the beginning. When the Spirit is in control, the numbers will be greater than any man will ever know. And when the Spirit is not. It was in 1957 that C.C. Ford flew me on a 2-week visit to a dozen chapters through the South. We were especially impressed with the group in Houston, Texas. Over 600 turned out for a Saturday breakfast meeting. I don't know, one man said dejectedly, as a few of us sat around talking afterwards. We should be reaching thousands, not just hundreds. But you've only been going a few months, I said. It takes time to. Not in Texas. In Texas, we do things big and we do them in a hurry. He jumped to his feet, a lean, rangy real estate salesman. His own career was perfect proof of his words. Let's rent a hall. Hire a sound truck. Go out on all the radio stations. Get this town on its feet. Andy Sorrell, president of the chapter, shook his head doubtfully, but the other man took no notice. We'll rent City Auditorium. Seats 6,600. When people hear Damos Shakarian's in town, we'll pack the place out. I looked up at him in horror. Me? Who would want to hear me? I'm no speaker. Besides, I've got to get back for the hay buying. But the fellow would hear no arguments. Cece and I would be traveling another week visiting chapters in Louisiana and Mississippi. Come back through Houston. A week is plenty of time to get the word out in Texas. And because the man's love of God was also Texas-sized, I let myself be convinced, or almost. All through the next 10 days, I forced down the knowledge that the big Houston rally was wrong. If there was one thing I had learned in the 6 years of the fellowship, it was that in this mysterious reality called the body of Christ, each individual had his special function. Some men were born organizers, some were anointed speakers, others could counsel, and when anyone assumed a function that wasn't his, he not only did a second-rate job, he blocked the flow of power to the person it did belong to. As for my job, I'd been sure of it ever since trumpets rang out in the Hollywood Hills. I was a helper. My gift was to provide a place and a time and a way for other men to shine. It wasn't a lesser gift than anyone else's, or greater. It was simply mine. But my name in lights over an auditorium, a meeting focused on me, it was wrong. And the more I struggled to prepare my speech, the more wrong I knew it was. What's the problem? CC would ask as page after crumpled page of notes landed in the wastebasket. You've given hundreds of speeches. But that wasn't true. I never gave speeches. I stood up and, talked. As long as I was doing what I'd been called to do, introduce other men, show people what their own possibilities were, the words were there. But at the thought of thousands of faces turned to me for leadership, my mind had gone blank. By the time we got back to Houston, I was on a state verging on panic. Andy and Maxine Sorrell had invited us to their home for dinner beforehand, but I was too worked up to eat. Even at the risk of offending their cook, Lottie Jefferson, I only stabbed at my food. Around 6:45, we set out for the city auditorium in 2 cars. Lottie Jefferson, Andy, Maxine couldn't come, Cece and me, and 3 other dinner guests. From a mile away, we could see the lights of the place, glowing like the fires of judgment. Uniformed parking attendants sprang to open our car doors. In the vast parking lot, there were exactly 5 other automobiles. We looked at our watches. 7:15. The rally was scheduled to start at 7:30. We walked through a side door into the big auditorium, eerily bright and silent. No one inside but a custodian way in the rear. I got the spots fixed the way you wanted them, he shouted, catching sight of the real estate broker. We walked slowly down the center aisle, footsteps echoing in the cavernous hall. The 5 cars must belong to the custodian and the lot attendants. There was a row of chairs on the spotlit stage, but nobody felt like going up there. We filed into 7 seats near the front. We didn't fill half of 1 row. And I looked at my watch again, 7:25. And now a wild, ecstatic hope began to fill me. Maybe no one would come. No one at all. Maybe God was simply stepping in to protect me from my own disobedience. I'm sure I got the date right in the papers, the real estate fellow kept saying. At 7:30, he, too, began to pray that nobody at all would show up. What would we say to them? How explain the mammoth rally where nobody came? By 8 o'clock, it was clear that God had done the impossible. In a city where 600 men could turn out early on a Saturday morning, he had simply drawn a veil of invisibility over a meeting that lacked his blessing. The real estate man, with a heart as big as Texas, was the first to say it out loud and to praise God for it. But now, what do we do? Asked Andy. We've rented this big place for the evening. Shall we have a meeting anyhow, just the 7 of us? You've got something written out, Deimos, said Cece, but nothing could have dragged from my pocket those much scratched out pages. Well then, I'll give the talk. It was Lottie Jefferson. I've always wanted to speak in a beautiful place like this. She got out of her seat, stepped to the front of the auditorium, and began to speak. She was a tiny little person, couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds, but when she talked about Jesus, her voice filled that 6,600-seat auditorium. For 35 minutes, she preached as though every seat in that place had been filled, and so full of God's love and truth was every word that I felt all the tensions of the past week drained from me. The only thing I didn't understand was the altar call she gave at the end, because, of course, the 6 of us in her audience had all long ago given our hearts to Jesus as she was asking us to do. Still, it had been a wonderful talk, one I would never forget. I heard footsteps. Down the long empty aisle came the custodian, tears streaming down his face, to kneel in front of the platform and give his heart to Jesus. And Lottie Jefferson, with the manner of an evangelist who every day receives hundreds into the kingdom, put her hands on his head and began to pray with him. Who knows? Maybe there hadn't been any mistake. Maybe the city auditorium on that night was God's place for us after all. And this man, the person he was seeking, only knew that I'd been reminded once again. I wondered if other people needed repeating as often as I did, that it is only the Spirit who can draw men to Jesus. And it is only the Spirit's gifts which he will use for this task. He had not given me the gift of evangelism. I was to be a witness, of course. Every Christian is. Only the place where I'd be talking about Jesus would more likely be a cow barn than a platform. That was the original dream God had given me after all. An automobile salesman like Linwood Safford in Washington, D.C., talking about God to other auto dealers. An attorney like Kermit Bradford in Atlanta, Georgia, telling other lawyers. A dairyman talking to other cattle farmers. It came so naturally that way, starting with a common language, a common interest. Like the interest every dairy farmer feels in cattle breeding, to us it's the most fascinating topic in the world, the search for that elusive perfect animal who will invariably pass his good qualities on to the next generations. Every month I'd pore over the journal of the Holstein Friesian Association, studying genealogy tables, and each time I'd be impressed all over again by the Burke bloodline being developed at the Pabst farm up in Wisconsin. I remember walking through those spotless calf barns for the very first time, looking for the little bull who would introduce this line into our herds. The first animal I stopped to admire was priced at $25,000, many times more than I could pay. There were animals among these 2 and 3 month olds selling for $50,000, others the same age going for $1,000. And suddenly I saw him in a pen along the south wall of the barn, a sturdy little fellow who stood out from the others as though a light had shined on him. It was the same phenomenon that never ceased to amaze me at meetings of the fellowship, where in a room full of 400 people I would suddenly see the man I was to call on next. Now this 200-pound youngster stood out the same way. I went over to his stall. His name was Pabst Leader. His price, $5,000. I read the particulars on him and liked what I saw. His dam was graded E, excellent milk production. His sire had already fathered over 50 E daughters. But these things were only confirmation of what I had known when I saw him. "I'll take Pabst Leader," I said when the farm manager caught up with me. Mr. Sylvester looked at me curiously. Breeders never made up their minds so quickly, only after extensive consultations with their advisors. "Are you sure? I wanted to show you some animals in the next barn, and Mr. Pabst thought you'd be interested in." "Quite sure, Mr. Sylvester. Well, we had the animal crated up and shipped out to us at an additional cost of $350, and I put down $5,350 against Leader's account. Generally, a bull's first $10 give an accurate picture of what he will do. Every one of a Leader's first 10 inherited her father's superior qualities: appearance, disease resistance, the high-quality milk production of his strain. Even some of our spindliest little cows produce offspring with none of their own shortcomings and all of his assets. Over the 15 years that we bred him, he sired over 5,000 daughters, every one stamped with their father's unmistakable quality. Pabst Leader was that animal in a million with the ability to pass on his own likeness every single time. Meanwhile, Mr. Sylvester reported dolefully an animal that had sold the same season for $50,000 had not proved a reliable sire. He wasn't worth $5,000, and the little fellow you picked was worth double $50,000. It was not an isolated experience. Every bull we bought from the Pabst farm proved to be a top investment. Witness? I couldn't help it. I remember the day Mr. Sylvester leaned across the table in the farm dining room, very serious and solemn. "Come on now, Shakarian. You're not making these choices on the spot the way you pretend. You have an advisor, don't you? Someone who travels ahead of you and makes recommendations." "Well, Mr. Sylvester, as a matter of fact, yes, I do." He glanced triumphantly around the table. "I knew it. Who is he? Come on. We won't rate the price on you because we know the one he's looking at." "You mean you really don't know who my advisor is?" "No, really. We get buyers and brokers through here by the dozen all the time. Your man's obviously a pro." knows more about animals than all of us in this room together. An old-timer, eh? He's been in the business longer than anyone. Specializes in Holsteins, does he? Oh, absolutely. Of course, I kept it up as long as I could. By the time I gave them the name of my advanced man, I couldn't have had a more breathless audience. The Lord Jesus made these animals, I told them. You and I can only look at pedigrees. He sees what's inside an animal. And a man, too. It was the perfect opening into the hearts and minds of those men. The chance to show God alive in the world a man knows. That's what the fellowship was all about. The world a man knows. I thought of the time our chapter in Lancaster, Pennsylvania was having such a hard time gaining acceptance in that conservative farming community. The chief objections seemed to be that the fellowship came from outside, that our needs and problems were somehow different from theirs. So one time, when Rose and I were in Lancaster, the chapter invited several dozen local farmers to be their guests at dinner, and I stood up as a fellow farmer and tried to get them to join in the give and take. Stony silence. You know how it is. The worse you're doing, the worse you make it. As my confidence grew smaller, my gestures got larger. I opened both arms, then swept them toward me. The fellowship depends on the participation of all of us, but the only thing my arms gathered in was the milk pitcher in the center of the table. It toppled over, sending milk streaming down the front of my best suit into my shoes. Too mortified to know what I was doing, I put one foot on the table and began to dry the shoe with the white tablecloth. There was a gasp from Rose. Deimos, what are you doing? And looking down at the table, I saw. Hastily, I lowered my foot. I felt my face flush scarlet and wished the rest of me could disappear beneath the table, too. I guess I thought I was out in the barn for a minute there, folks. I apologized. Any of you ever been milking a cow and suddenly had her kick the whole pail over on you? There was a chuckle from somewhere in the back of the room, then all at once an explosion of laughter. The room rocked with it for several minutes, and the meeting was transformed. Grizzled old farmers stood up and told how God had helped them through winter blizzards and summer droughts, and by the end of the evening, the Lancaster chapter had a lot of new members. Do you know what changed our minds? Men said to me later. It was when you put your foot on the table. We realized then that you really were a farmer, just like us.